The wind didn't just howl that year. It screamed like a banshee tearing through the Montana high country, a sound so piercing it could freeze the blood in your veins before the cold ever touched your skin. They called it the Great Die-Up of 1886, a winter so vicious it buried history under 10 feet of white silence and turned the mighty Rockies into a graveyard of ice. But for Silas Thorne, a man who had long ago traded the warmth of society for the solitude of the jagged peaks, the storm was just another ghost to ignore, another adversary to outlast in a life built on survival. That was until he saw the splash of color against the endless grays, a torn piece of blue calico, fluttering from a buried stagecoach like a flag of surrender. Most men would have turned their horses around, knowing that nothing living could survive the drift. But Silas wasn't most men. He was a wolf hunter, a creature of the cold, and when he saw the hand reaching out from the snow, pale as marble and trembling with the last beat of life, he knew his solitude was about to end. He didn't know it yet, but the woman buried in that drift wasn't just a survivor. She was the reckoning he had been running from for 10 years. This is your narrator, Marcus, from Frontier Rescue Stories. If you love tales of the Old West, of survival, redemption, rugged justice, and romance that blooms against all odds, you have come to the right place. Before we dive into this journey, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this video, and smash subscribe. Your support helps us stir up the algorithm and bring these campfire tales to a larger audience. Also, I love hearing from you, so drop a comment down below and let me know which part of the world you are tuning in from today. The silence of the mountains was usually Silas Thorne's only companion, a heavy, suffocating blanket that he wrapped around himself like his buffalo robe. But today, the silence was broken by the labored breathing of the burden slung across his saddle. The gelding, a massive roan named Iron, snorted clouds of steam into the biting air, wading chest-deep through drifts that would have swallowed a lesser beast. Silas walked ahead, breaking the trail with his snowshoes, his breath icing his beard into a jagged mask of frost. He didn't look back at the woman slumped over the horse's withers. He didn't want to see if she was still breathing. In his experience, hope was a dangerous thing. To carry in the high country, it weighed more than a pack of wet beaver plues and paid out far less. He had pulled her from the wreckage of a mud wagon, stagecoach that had slid off, the switchback miles below. The driver was gone, likely frozen or run off by the wolves, whose tracks circled the wreck like a tightening noose. She was the only thing left alive, wrapped in a thin wool coat that was about as useful as paper against a Montana blizzard. She was small, fragile-looking, with hair the color of dried wheat. That had spilled out of her bonnet when he lifted her. Now she was just a bundle of potential grief heading toward his cabin. The cabin wasn't much to look at, a low-slung structure of hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, tucked under the overhang of a granite cliff face to keep the worst of the north wind at bay. It smelled of wood smoke, curing hides, and the deep, musky scent of a man who lived alone. Silas kicked the snow from his boots and shoved the heavy oak door open, the leather hinges groaning in protest against the frost. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or gentle introductions. He hauled the woman inside and laid her on the pile of furs that served as his bed. The fire in the hearth was nothing but embers, glowing like angry eyes in the dark. Silas moved with the efficient economy of a man who knew that wasted motion meant wasted heat. He stoked the fire, feeding it splits of seasoned pine until the flames licked up the chimney, casting dancing shadows against the walls adorned with traps, a long Hawken rifle, and the drying skins of wolves. He turned to the woman. She hadn't moved. Her skin was a terrifying shade of blue-white, waxy and cold to the touch. He knew the protocol. He had seen frostbite take fingers, toes, and noses from greenhorns who didn't respect the cold. If he didn't get her warm and fast, she'd be dead before the sun went down behind the ridge. "Wow," he grunted, the sound rough in a throat unused to speaking. "Aren't this a fix?" He hesitated only a moment before his knife flashed in the firelight. He wasn't going to cut her, but he had to get the wet, frozen clothes off her body. Modesty was a luxury for the warm and the living. Out here, wet wool was a death sentence, drawing heat from the core faster than the air itself. He sliced through the laces of her boots, peeling them away to reveal feet that were dangerously pale. He worked quickly, his large calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he removed the layers of sodden calico and linen. When she was stripped down to her chemise, he buried her under a mountain of buffalo robes and wool blankets, tucking them in tight around her chin to trap every ounce of heat. He rubbed her hands and feet with snow first, an old trapper's trick to bring the blood back slowly without bursting the veins, then wrapped warm stones from the hearth in rags and placed them at her feet. Then he sat. He sat in the rough-hewn chair by the fire, his Hawken rifle resting across his knees, and he watched. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, shallow and ragged. He watched the color slowly, painfully seep back into her face. He was a man who waited for wolves in the dead of night. He knew how to wait for death, but he found himself oddly unsettled by waiting for life. Hours passed. The wind outside battered the cabin, shaking the heavy timbers, whistling through the chinking like a forgotten spirit trying to get in. The sun dipped, plunging the interior into a gloom broken only by the orange glow of the hearth. Silas brewed a pot of coffee, thick black sludge that he boiled in a tin pot. Arbuckles. It was the only luxury he allowed himself, traded for pelts at the rendezvous months ago. A sound from the bed made him freeze, his hand halfway to his mouth with the tin cup. "Father?" The voice was a whisper, cracked and dry. Silas set the cup down and leaned forward. The woman's eyes were open, glassy and unfocused, roving around the ceiling of the cabin. She wasn't seeing the logs or the drying herbs. She was seeing something else, somewhere else. "Not your father, miss," Silas rumbled. His voice sounded like gravel grinding together, unused to the softness of conversation. Her head snapped toward him, and her eyes widened in terror. She tried to scramble backward, but the weight of the buffalo robes pinned her down. She gasped, the cold air of the cabin hitting her lungs, and started to cough, a deep, wet hacking that rattled in her chest like loose stones. "Easy," Silas said, not moving. He knew he looked like a monster to her. He was 6'4", with a beard that reached his chest and a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a Blackfoot arrow years ago. He was dressed in buckskins that were stained with grease and blood. "You're safe. Found you in the drift." The coach," she stammered, her teeth chattering violently. "The driver, Mr. Henderson." "Gone," Silas said flatly. "Wolves or the cold, don't matter which." She squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking out to freeze on her cheeks. I was coming to Bannock, to teach." "You missed Bannock by about 40 miles and 3,000 feet of elevation," Silas said, standing up. He moved to the fire and poured a cup of the coffee, adding a splash of whiskey from a clay jug. He walked over to the bed and held it out. "Drink. It'll put fire in your belly." She looked at the cup, then at him, fear warring with desperation. She managed to free a hand from the blankets, a delicate pale thing that looked like it had never held anything heavier than a book, and took the cup. Her hand shook so bad she spilled some on the furs. Silas reached out and steadied the cup, his large hand engulfing hers. "Slow," he commanded. She took a sip, choking on the bitterness and the burn of the alcohol, but she swallowed it. Who are you?" "Thorne," he said. "Silas Thorne." "I am Aara," she whispered. "Aara Vance." "Well, Aara Vance," Silas said, taking the cup back. "You picked a hell of a place to get lost. Storm settled in. We ain't going nowhere for a long while." He walked back to his chair and sat down, turning his gaze back to the fire. He could feel her eyes on him, watching, assessing. He didn't like it. He was used to being the observer, not the observed. He felt a strange tightening in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he buried his brother 10 years ago. It was the heavy, crushing weight of responsibility. "Why?" she asked softly from the darkness of the bed. "Why what? Why did you save me?" Silas looked at the flames, watching a piece of pine sap pop and hiss. He thought about the blue calico fluttering in the wind. He thought about the easy silence he had lost. "Beaver weren't biting," he muttered. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But it was the only answer he had. Outside, the wind screamed louder, piling the snow high against the door, sealing them in a tomb of ice and timber. The long winter had truly begun. 3 days. That's how long the blizzard hammered the mountain, burying the cabin until the only light came down the chimney. For 3 days they existed in a twilight world of firelight and shadow. The isolation was absolute. There was no world outside the four walls of the cabin, no law but the thermodynamics of heat and cold. For Aara, the first day was a blur of exhaustion and fear. She drifted in and out of sleep, watching the giant man move about his domain. He was terrifying, yes, a relic of a violent land, but he was also surprisingly domesticated in his own way. She watched him grease his traps with bear fat, mend his moccasins with sinew using a bone needle, and cook stew in a cast-iron Dutch oven. He ignored her mostly, treating her like a piece of furniture he hadn't decided where to place yet. By the second day, the fear began to recede, replaced by a dull, aching boredom and the rising heat of fever. She tried to stand once, to help him with the fire, but her legs crumpled under her. Silas had caught her before she hit the floor, swinging her back onto the furs with an effortless grunt of annoyance. "Stay put, woman," he had growled. "You're frail as a willow twig." "I am not frail," she had snapped back, the fever giving her a sudden, reckless courage. "I am a schoolteacher. I have managed a classroom of 30 boys in Boston. I can handle a fire." "Boston isn't the Bitterroots," Silas retorted, shoving a piece of firewood into the stove with unnecessary force. "And those boys didn't have teeth like the wind out there. You try to chop wood in this state and you'll freeze your lungs before you swing the axe." But by the third night, the defiance was gone. The fever Aara had been fighting flared up with a vengeance. She woke up thrashing, the buffalo robes feeling like lead weights. Her chest felt like it was filled with broken glass every time she inhaled. Silas was at her side instantly. He placed a hand on her forehead. It was burning hot, dry as parchment. "Lung fever," he cursed softly. "Pneumonia." This was the killer of the mountains. It took the strong and the weak alike, filling their lungs with fluid until they drowned in their own bodies. Silas looked at her, seeing the flush on her cheeks and the glazing of her eyes. He felt a surge of panic, alien and sharp. He didn't know this woman, not really. But the thought of her dying here, under his roof, after he dragged her from the snow, made him sick. "Please," she whimpered, clutching at his buckskin shirt. "It's so hot. Open the window, please." "Can't do that, Aara," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "Cold will kill you quicker than the heat." He went to his shelves, rummaging through the jars and pouches. He needed willow bark. He needed to break the fever. He found a bundle of dried bark, stripped from the white willows down by the creek in the fall. It was bitter medicine, but the salicylic acid in the bark was the only thing that could bring the temperature down. He crumbled it into a pot of boiling water, adding a pinch of dried mint to settle the stomach. He brought the steaming cup to her. "Drink this. It tastes like mud, but it'll help." She turned her head away, delirious. "No, no more tea. Mother says it's time for lessons." "Drink it!" Silas barked, lifting her head. He forced the cup to her lips. She sputtered and coughed, but she swallowed. For the next 12 hours, Silas waged a war against the fever. He bathed her face with cool water from the bucket near the door. He kept the fire roaring to keep the drafts at bay, stripping down to his undershirt as the cabin turned into a sweat lodge. He sat by her side, holding her hand when the nightmares came, listening to her ramble about Boston, about a man named Thomas who had broken her heart, about the loneliness of the journey west. In her delirium, she saw past his scars. She grabbed his hand, pressing it to her burning cheek. "Thomas, why did you leave?" Silas stiffened. "I am not Thomas," he whispered. "I'm Silas." "Don't leave me," she murmured, her eyes fluttering closed. "It's so dark." "I am not leaving," Silas said. "I'm right here, anchored like a root." He stayed awake through the night, watching the firelight play across her face. He found himself studying her, the curve of her jaw, the determination in her brow, even in sleep. She was beautiful, yes, in a way that didn't belong here. She was porcelain in a world of granite, but she was fighting. She was fighting the fever with a grit that impressed him. Toward dawn, the fever broke. She woke up soaked in sweat, weak as a kitten, but her eyes were clear. She looked up to find Silas asleep in the chair, his head lolled back, the rifle still across his lap. She watched him for a long time. She saw the gray in his beard, the lines of pain etched around his eyes, even in sleep. She saw the lonely man beneath the mountain legend. and for the first time since she boarded the stagecoach in the east, she didn't feel lost. Silas snorted awake, his hand tightening on the rifle reflexively. He blinked, seeing her watching him. "You're alive," he stated, rubbing his face. "Disappointed?" she asked, her voice raspy but steady. A corner of Silas's mouth twitched. It might have been a smile. "Not entirely. You snore, you know." "I do not," she protested, a faint blush coloring her pale cheeks. "Like a grizzly with a sinus infection," Silas said, standing up to stretch. His back popped audibly. "Hungry?" "Starving," she admitted. "Good. That means you'll live." He moved to the pot hanging over the fire. "Got some broth. And if you're feeling brave, some pemmican." "Pemmican?" "Meat, fat, and berries pounded into a brick," Silas explained. "Keeps you alive. Don't taste like much, but it sticks to your ribs. It's what kept the voyageurs paddling for 18 hours a day. It'll keep you breathing." Aara sat up, pulling the robes around her. "Thank you, Silas, for everything. I think I would have died last night." Silas ladled soup into a wooden bowl. He didn't look at her. "You aren't out of the woods yet, Aara. The fever's gone, but the snow's still here. And the food?" He paused, looking at the dwindling supply of venison jerky hanging from the rafters. "The food is getting low." Aara followed his gaze. She saw the worry he tried to hide. "How low?" "Low enough," Silas said. "If this storm don't break soon, we're going to have to start boiling the moccasins." He handed her the bowl. The moment of levity was gone, replaced by the crushing reality of their situation. They were alive, but the mountain hadn't finished with them yet. Survival is a game of mathematics. Calories in versus calories out. Thermal units retained versus heat lost to the void. Silas knew the math, and the numbers weren't adding up. A week passed. Then 2. The storm had technically ended, but the big die-up had settled in. The temperature hovered at 30 below zero. The snow was packed so high it covered the single window of the cabin, leaving them in a perpetual subterranean gloom. They were buried alive. The confinement did something to the air in the cabin. It became charged, electric with the tension of 2 people occupying a space meant for 1. They fell into a routine. Aara, her strength slowly returning, took over the domestic duties. She cleaned, she mended his torn shirts, she organized his chaotic shelves. Silas chopped wood, endless amounts of wood, tunneling out the front door to the drift where he had stacked his cordwood in the fall. They talked. At first it was just necessities. Pass the salt. Stoke the fire. But slowly the silence between them filled with stories. Aara told him of the cobblestone streets of Boston, of the smell of the ocean, of the suffocating expectations of high society that had driven her west. "They wanted me to marry a banker," she said one evening, sewing a button onto his flannel shirt. "A man who looked at me and saw a decoration. I wanted to see if I could be something else." "So you came to the wildest place on God's earth to find yourself?" Silas asked, whittling a piece of pine into a trigger mechanism for a trap. "Maybe I wanted to get lost," she countered. "What about you, Silas? Were you running from a banker too?" Silas's knife paused. He looked at the fire. "Running from myself, mostly, and I wasn't fast enough." He told her then, haltingly, about the brother he lost, not to the cold, but to a river crossing gone wrong. How he had held the rope, and how it had slipped. The guilt that had driven him up here, where the only judgment came from the wind and the wolves. "I reckoned if I stayed away from folks I couldn't hurt 'em," Silas said quietly. Aara reached out, placing her hand on his forearm. The contact was electric. "You saved me, Silas. You held onto the rope this time." Silas looked at the fire, unable to meet her gaze. The guilt was a familiar cloak, and he wasn't sure he knew how to take it off. But her touch, warm, alive, forgiving, sent a fissure through his resolve. "Maybe," he grunted, but the rope still taut. A sound from outside shattered the moment. A howl. Close, too close. Silas was on his feet in a second, the rifle in his hands. He moved to the door, listening. Another howl answered, then another, a chorus of hunger rising from the snow. "Wolves," Aara whispered, the color draining from her face. They smell the cooking grease, Silas said grimly. They're starving too. The deer are yarded up deep in the timber or dead under the drifts. The pack is getting desperate. He opened the peephole in the door. In the moonlight reflecting off the snow, he saw them. Shadows moving against the white. Gaunt, skeletal shapes. There were at least 10 of them. They're circling, Silas muttered, testing the perimeter. Can they get in? Aara asked, her voice trembling. Not through the logs, Silas said. But they can wait us out, and they know we're in here. They know we're meat. The siege had begun. For the next 3 nights, the wolves didn't leave. They scratched at the door, their claws rasping against the wood like dry bones. They howled incessantly, a psychological warfare that grated on the nerves. Sleep became impossible. But the real enemy wasn't the wolves outside. It was the hunger inside. The pemmican was gone. The jerky was a memory. They had been living on boiled coffee grounds and the last scraping of flour for 3 days. Silas looked at Aara on the 4th morning. Her face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp under her skin. She was weak again, the lethargy of starvation setting in. He knew the signs. The body starts to consume itself. First the fat, then the muscle, then the mind. I have to go out, Silas said, strapping on his snowshoes. No, Aara said, grabbing his arm. She was weak, but her grip was desperate. Silas, the wolves, they're right there. They're weak too, Silas said, checking the prime on his rifle. And if I don't get us meat, we won't wake up in 2 days. There's an elk herd that winters in the Box Canyon 3 miles east. If I can get one. It's suicide, she pleaded. It's survival, Silas said. He looked down at her, and his eyes softened. He reached out, his rough thumb brushing her cheek. I'm coming back, Aara. I promise you. I ain't letting the rope slip. He kissed her then. It was brief, rough, tasting of coffee and desperation, but it sealed a pact between them. He turned, unbarred the door, and stepped out into the blinding white. Aara rushed to the peephole. She watched him trudge away, a dark speck against the immensity of the snow. She saw the shadows detach themselves from the tree line and start to follow him. Please, she whispered to the empty cabin. Please. She paced the cabin, the silence now screaming at her. She checked the fire. She sharpened the skinning knife he had left on the table. She felt the weight of the cabin pressing down on her. The waiting was agony. It was the same waiting Silas had done by her bedside, but now she was the one watching the clock of life and death tick down. The silence returned, but now it was heavy with dread. Aara paced the small cabin, counting the seconds, the minutes. 1 hour, 2. He should be back. He said the canyon was close. She checked the fire. She checked the water bucket. She tried to read the tattered Bible Silas kept on the mantel, but the words swam before her eyes. The Lord is my shepherd. A crack echoed through the valley. A gunshot. Aara froze. It was distant, muffled by the snow, but unmistakable. 1 shot, then silence. She waited. 10 minutes, 20, no second shot, no shout of triumph, just the wind hissing through the eaves. He's coming back, she told herself aloud. He's dressing the kill. He's heavy laden. But an hour passed, and the sun began to dip toward the western peaks, turning the snow blood red. The wolves hadn't howled in a while. That was worse. Silence meant they were busy. Aara looked at the snowshoes hanging on the wall, the spare pair, smaller, meant for a guest who never came. She looked at the heavy skinning knife on the table. She looked at the door. Fear told her to stay. Fear told her she was a schoolteacher from Boston, that she would die within 100 yards of the cabin. But then she remembered Silas's hand on her cheek. She remembered the promise. I ain't letting the rope slip. Neither am I, she whispered. She grabbed the snowshoes. She put on every layer of clothing she had, topped with one of Silas's old coats that swallowed her frame. She took the knife and a hatchet. She stepped out. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. The world was a blinding expanse of white and blue. She found his tracks, deep post holes in the snow, and the dragging tracks of the wolves alongside them. She followed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She walked for what felt like miles, her legs burning, the snowshoes awkward on her feet. She crested a ridge and looked down into a small draw. There was blood on the snow, a lot of it, bright arterial spray that looked shockingly red against the white. "Silas!" she screamed, her voice snatched away by the wind. She saw movement at the bottom of the draw, a dark shape lying in the snow, and two gray forms circling it, low to the ground. The rest of the pack must have chased the elk, but these two had stayed for the easier meal. Aara didn't think. She didn't calculate the odds. She let out a scream of pure primal rage and charged down the slope, waving the hatchet. "Get away!" she shrieked. "Get away from him!" The wolves, startled by this banshee descending from the ridge, looked up. They were gaunt, ribs showing through their mangy coats. They weren't the monsters of legend. They were starving animals, but they were dangerous. One snarled, baring yellow teeth, but Aara didn't stop. She ran right at them, swinging the hatchet with clumsy, desperate force. The lead wolf snapped at her, its jaws clamping onto the thick wool of Silas's coat she wore. She swung the hatchet, the blade biting into the animal's shoulder. It yelped and scrambled back, blood matting its gray fur. The pack mentality broke. They were weak, and this new prey was too aggressive. They turned and slunk off into the trees, watching, waiting for another opening. Aara dropped to her knees beside Silas. He was conscious, but barely. His face was gray. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and there was a deep gash on his thigh where a wolf had gotten lucky. "Aara?" he rasped, his eyes unfocused. You shouldn't be here." "Shut up, Silas," she sobbed, tearing at her petticoat to make a tourniquet. "I'm saving you, that's the deal. You save me, I save you." "Legs broke," he grunted through clenched teeth as she tied the fabric tight above the wound. "Fell, hit a rock. Then they came." "Can you stand?" "No." "Then you'll crawl," she said fiercely, "and I'll drag you." She looked around. There was no way she could carry him. She fashioned a travois of sorts using his rifle and a sapling she hacked down, tying it with the laces from his pack. It was crude, but it worked. She harnessed herself to him, the leather straps digging into her shoulders. "Ready?" she asked. "Aara," Silas groaned. "Leave me. You can't make it pulling me." "I am not leaving you," she shouted, her voice echoing off the rocks. "Now push." The trek back was a nightmare. Every step was a battle against gravity and friction. The snow grabbed at the sled. The cold gnawed at her face, but Aara Vance, the delicate flower of Boston, found a reservoir of steel in her spine. She pulled until her lungs burned, until her vision blurred. She thought of the banker she refused to marry. She thought of the empty classroom, and she thought of Silas's hand on her cheek. She pulled him up the ridge. She pulled him across the flat. And as the last light of day faded, she saw the cabin. Smoke was still curling from the chimney. She dragged him through the door and collapsed on the floor, gasping for air, unable to move. Silas reached out, his hand shaking, and found hers. "Wah," he whispered, a sound of pure admiration. "You're a tiger, woman, a pure tiger." The recovery was slow. Silas's leg was bad, a clean break, but one that required setting. Aara had done it, following his grunted instructions, pulling the bone until it snapped back into place, while he bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. She splinted it with cedar shakes and bound it tight. She cleaned the wolf bite with whiskey and packed it with pine sap to keep the infection out. For the next month, the roles were reversed. Aara hunted, setting snares for rabbits nearby, checking the woodpile. She nursed him, changing the dressings, cooking the rabbit stew. She became the provider, the protector. They survived. They ate the boiled rabbits. They drank the weak coffee, and they talked. The walls of the cabin no longer felt like a prison. They felt like a home. The dynamic had shifted. Silas no longer looked at her as a burden, but as an equal. A partner. Then, in late February, the wind changed. It didn't scream from the north anymore. It sighed from the west, a warm, wet wind, the Chinook, the snow eater. Overnight, the temperature shot up. The icicles hanging from the eaves began to drip, a rhythmic tapping that sounded like a clock restarting. The massive drifts slumped and melted, revealing the brown earth beneath. The creek roared to life, breaking its icy chains. Spring had come. With the thaw came the reality of the world outside. The road to Bannock would be open within a week. The stagecoaches would run again. Silas was sitting on the porch, his leg propped up, whittling. Aara came out, holding 2 cups of coffee. She looked at the melting snow, and her face was unreadable. She wore the buckskins as if she had been born in them, her hair braided back, her hands rough and capable. "Road's opening," Silas said, not looking up. "Yes," she said. "You can hail the next wagon, get to Bannock, that teaching job. They might still be waiting." "They might," Aara said. She took a sip of coffee. "And you? Will you stay here?" Silas stopped whittling. He looked at the vast, empty mountains. They were beautiful again, green poking through the white. But for the first time in 10 years, they looked empty. Truly empty. He realized that the silence he had cherished was actually just loneliness in disguise. "I don't know," he said. "Cabin feels big. Too big for one man now." Aara turned to him. She wasn't the frightened girl in the blue calico anymore. She was part of the mountain now. She had bled into this snow, just as he had. "I don't think I'd make a very good school teacher anymore," she said softly. "I catch myself looking for wolf tracks when I walk. I know how to skin a rabbit. I know how to set a bone. I know how to listen to the wind." Silas looked up at her. "It's a hard life, Aara. Lonely, cold. You saw what happened. You almost died." "I haven't been cold in a long time, Silas," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "Not since the fever broke. Not since you pulled me from that drift." Silas stood up, testing his weight on the healing leg. It held. He limped over to her, towering over her, smelling of pine and wood smoke. He saw the strength in her jaw, the fire in her eyes. "I am not a banker," he said gruffly. "I got nothing to offer but this cabin, a few miles of trap line, and a bad leg." "I don't want a banker," Aara said, stepping closer, placing her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "I want the man who didn't let the rope slip. I want the wolf hunter." Silas let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since winter began. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. "Then you're home, Aara," he whispered. "You're home." They stood there on the porch as the sun climbed high over the Rockies, the snow melting into water that fed the rivers, washing away the pain of the past, leaving only the green promise of the future. The wolf hunter had found his redemption, and the school teacher had found her wild. And that, my friends, is how the winter of '86 changed 2 lives forever. It just goes to show that sometimes the storms we fear the most are the very things that steer us to where we belong. Silas and Aara didn't just survive the cold. They conquered the ghosts that haunted them. They found warmth in the frozen wastes and love where only wolves dared to tread. If this story warmed your spirit, please take a moment to hit that like button. It helps the channel more than you know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join our wagon train for more stories of the frontier, of love, and of survival against the odds. I want to hear from you in the comments. Aara had to make a terrifying choice to go out into the storm to save Silas. Have you ever had to make a choice that scared you, but you knew it was the right thing to do? Let me know down below. Check out this playlist right here for more tales of mountain men and the brave women who tamed their hearts. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon. Take care, folks.